wouldn't that really have been a good time, the perfect time to pull me aside and say, hey, I've got some information. I mean, we're going through this diagnostic process, and that kind of information would have been important, but she never did. And I feel angry about that.
Hello, you are listening to NPE Stories. This is a podcast where NPEs can share their story. I am your host, Lily, and I found out I was an NPE through an ancestry DNA test that changed my life forever. NPE is a term that stands for Not Parent Expected or Non-Paternal Event. This means that one or more of our parents are not who we believe them to be. NPE Stories is a podcast where NPEs can share their story of what their original family was like, how they found out they were an NPE, and what their journey has been like since the day they found out. Welcome to episode 87. Today I am speaking with Marilyn. Hi, Marilyn.
Hi, Lily. It's so nice to talk to you.
It's really nice to talk to you as well. How did you find this podcast by chance?
I actually found it by listening to some of the stories that are on the DNA Facebook support group. And somewhere along the line, they mentioned you. And then I started listening. I thought, I want to share my story.
I'm so glad you found that. I'm glad people are mentioning it. There's so many great resources, wonderful podcasts out there. I listen to the other NPE podcasts as well. And I go onto DNA Facebook groups for NPEs, but there are rules often where you can't self-promote or share podcasts. So I never promote it, right? Like I never tell anyone there's a podcast. And I'm like, is anyone finding this? I'm glad you found it.
Well, I'll share it.
Yeah, exactly. You can share links to the podcast. I just can't. Okay, Miss Marilyn, we're going to hear your story today. So let's start at the beginning and let me know about your original family.
Okay. Well, first of all, I just want to say thank you so much for letting me share my story. And I just, I really appreciate your podcast. And I do think, hearing other people's stories is healing. And, as I was getting closer to planning what I was going to say, I was listening to more and more stories. And I thought, well, I'm going to share my great wisdom and make some suggestions to people listening that are, new or just found out. But the more I thought about it, by the time someone has found your podcast, or even found a DNA support group, things have already happened, or, they wish they could do a redo or re-say things. And, they've already probably made mistakes that they wish they could take back. When this first happened to me, I looked, but I really couldn't find like a playbook on what to do next, what to do first. I don't really think the general public, thinks too much about this, like the possibility of finding out, oh yeah, your dad or your mom, they're not your parent. I don't think it's really like out there. Now, I grew up in the 60s, and I know that there were things going on, like secret things going on in the world behind closed doors, like cheating husbands and wives and abuse. And, I'd hear whispers about such things. But I wasn't really, it wasn't really openly talked about. Not like today, where things are more open. So hopefully someday NPEs will have a bigger platform, and people or families will have heard this. So by the time, somebody pops up in their life, they won't maybe react so negatively that some of them do. So anyway, when I first talked to you, it was like 6 months ago.
Yeah.
And I was really a little disappointed that our podcast was so far out, but it really has worked so much better because I have gathered so much information since we first talked about my story, and it's so much more complete. So here's my story. So I'm 65, And I live in North Carolina with my husband and my 3 daughters and my mother-in-law. And about um, a year and a half ago, November 2019, I learned that the dad on my birth certificate was not my dad. Now, both my parents have passed away, and I found that my biological father has also passed away. And in fact, most everybody who would know anything about my past is gone. So I was raised in California, and I was born in Santa Monica. And for people who might not know that, Santa Monica is a beach community in the Los Angeles area. My parents were they were older. My mom was 37 and my dad was 42. Um, and in fact, really, they had an entire married life before I ever came along. They had been married 16 years before I was born, and they had grew up in the Depression, and they had moved from the Midwest. My mom, she was barely 19 when she moved to California with my dad and his 2 sisters. So that was 1937. And then they got married. And I think, for the most part, they must have felt like they were living the American dream. They had rented a house in Venice Beach, and they stayed married all of their life. They remained married for over 50 years. And then at some point, World War II, my dad joined the Army Air Corps, and he happened to be lucky enough to stay in the States. And my mom followed him from base to base, I think just to stay close to him. And then when he got out, he became a carpenter, and he was really successful. He would work and build houses like in Beverly Hills or Bel Air, the Hollywood area. They were actually doing quite well. So recently, I found out that they even own their own home in Santa Monica, and learned what a wonderful, like, super wife and homemaker my mom was. When each of my parents died, or I didn't have to, but I prepared a slideshow for their funeral. And I was going through the pictures, and you could see that they were a couple, and they had a good life together. They did things like hunting, and there was lots of parties, and you could see there was family around, and there was my dad's sisters, and now they had kids. And I think you could tell they were having a really great time. But as I grew up, they didn't talk too much about that part of their lives. I would just get little tidbits, but after looking at those old pictures, I also realized that after I was born, their marriage totally changed. They didn't seem like they're the same loving couple. They didn't seem to do things together anymore. Now, my mom, she just loved to share my birth story. And I know it so well because I heard it over and over again when I was growing up. Of course, I've learned since that that story she told um, was just made up and fake. But this is the story she would say. She said, that they had been married for 15 years, and that my mom wanted a baby really bad. And so she prayed and prayed and prayed, and I was the answer to her prayers. But they had trouble getting pregnant. So she said they went to the doctor, and the doctor said to my dad, now what you do is you build a slant board. Now, a slant board is a wooden board. I think it's about 12 inches wide. And you would place one end on the floor and the other end raised up somehow. And then you would have sex with my mother's head down. They would have sex, and then they would wait. And well, voila, here I am.
Oh
And,
my
as
gosh.
far as I know,
I've
the
never heard
pregnancy,
that.
yeah, I'm a lot older. Yeah, well, I mean, everybody bought it. So as far as I know, it was a normal pregnancy, except it ended up, she had toxemia, and she had to have a C-section. Of course, way back then in 1955, uh, the mothers, you went to sleep totally out. And so she said that when she woke up, they said, oh, guess what? You have a baby girl. And then she went on to say that she was so excited that she'd be wheeling down the hallways of the hospital. And she was like, I had a baby girl. I had a baby girl. She was telling everybody, I had a baby girl. So anyway, she seemed really happy about that. But just recently, I'm doing all this discovery, and I found out that she really had severe postpartum depression after that. I mean, she actually got catatonic. She couldn't function. She couldn't take care of me. She couldn't take care of my dad. And she ended up being hospitalized because of it. And back then, I think kind of like the go to treatment was electric shock therapy. And so she had that, and I've tried to do some research on that. And I think somehow it affected her personality, because growing up, she seemed kind of really emotionally unhinged to me.
Hmm.
But it wasn't just my mom; it was also my dad. I There's a couple of pictures of me when I was a baby. And to think of it, there isn't a whole lot of pictures of me when I was a baby, but there's one picture in particular that he's holding me. So, and it looks like a stranger has handed him this strange child, or I'm an alien child or something. I mean, he just doesn't look like that, like you would expect him to, like that excited dad. But whatever was going on, I don't know. When I was 6 months old, which seems so young to me, we left everything and moved 100 miles south to North San Diego County. And that's where I grew up. So when we got down there, Dad built a house, and it was 20 acres surrounded by 100 acres. I mean, it was really beautiful, big rolling hills, these fabulous views. But it was really isolating. The nearest house was just miles away. But when I was really young, after we moved there, I can remember lots of really big gatherings, weekend parties. I would wake up and there'd be like a motorhome parked behind the house, and there'd be men, they'd go hunting, and there was family visits, and my aunts and cousins, and even my godparents. I mean, I really remember this time as really fun. I don't know what happened. I don't know why that changed, but at some point, people stopped coming. Now, I'm going to say, my mom did the best she could as a parent, but she was a better parent before I was born. And she was kind of a step parent to one of my cousins. And so I got that information from her. But with me, she seemed to have no idea what good parenting was. Now, her mom had died when she was 14, and her dad had died when she was 10 or 11, and they were extremely poor. And she just hated her dad. When he was in the house, all 10 kids had to sit behind the wood stove on a wood bench, and they couldn't say a word. And she would talk about that, and she would curse him all the way up into her 90s. Now, after her mom died, she was moved around from relative to relative. And they weren't really happy to or glad to take on that responsibility. I think they were pretty hard on her. I think her life pretty much sucked. Um, so she did her best as my mom. And as I remember, really young, I was really attached to her. I was like this total mama's girl, and I couldn't leave her side. And she treated me like a princess, but more like a trophy or like a doll. I really felt like I was up on a pedestal. That may sound really great, but it really screwed me later because I learned no social skills. And she fought all my battles for me. She was always on my side. And in her eyes, I could do no wrong. You know, um, I never had to deal with conflict. So school was really hard, particularly in middle school. I had no skills to deal with other kids my age. And I had very few playmates. So, it was pretty hard going through school. But my dad, on the other hand, he was much different than my mom. He was soft spoken. He liked to tell stories. He liked to tell jokes. He liked to tell dirty jokes. Of course, they kicked me out of the room, and I'd always try to hear. But I got the impression that, he mostly enjoyed the time with his buddies, that he would rather hang out with the guys. Definitely not my mom or me. But, I do remember good times with him. One day, when I was pretty little, he took me across the field to a pond. and we were going to catch some tadpoles, and take them home and put them in a bowl or something and watch them grow into frogs. Well, as we were walking, there was these large patches of sagebrush. Now, sage grows in a round patch about 3 feet across, about 6 inches tall. And I'm hanging on his arm and I'm swinging, and he's swinging me forward as he stepped, and I'm jumping into the soft sage patches. All of a sudden, I'm like being propelled through the air over the patch, and I land and I turn around and I see my dad, and he pulls out his gun and he kills this massive rattlesnake. So, that's one of those memories that you don't forget. I also remember, our house was quite a ways from the main road, and my dad would let me sit on his lap and steer the truck all the way up to the house. I just remember us laughing, and it was just so much fun. Now my dad, he wasn't a hugger, and he didn't say, he loved me, but I never for a moment thought that, he wasn't my biological dad. I never felt unloved by him. So in my eyes, my dad was the nice one and my mom was the mean one. I never doubted my dad, but I often doubted my mother. She was the one, she'd take me to church and dance class and Girl Scouts. But then on the other side of that, she was the decider. She always yelled. She was the punisher. She did the hitting. She did the spanking. Even as a child, though, I can remember like some weird things that happened that didn't make sense. They make more sense now, but they didn't then. And, as I find out more of my history, I have to wonder if my biological father wasn't in communication with them, or at least my mom. So when I was really little, each Christmas, I would get like this fancy over the top Christmas cards from a Dr. Small. And these cards, they would have silver dollars taped in them. And they were like really fancy cards, particularly for the time. So they would have these springs, and you would open it and the reindeer would pop up, and I always looked forward to Dr. Small's cards. Okay, so Dr. Small was my mom's OB. He delivered me. I was not his patient. These cards were not addressed to my mom, his patient, but they're always, specifically addressed to me. It just doesn't make sense. And actually today I talked a little bit with my new biological cousin, and she remembers getting the silver dollars. That rang a bell with her. So, I really think that could have been my biological dad, still kind of being in my life. So, I've heard that he was a really caring guy. He was fairly wealthy, and he was a connected guy in the LA Hollywood area. So, I don't know. There was another weird thing. Well, I don't know how old I was. I was older. But let's see. I was probably, I don't know, 8, 9, maybe. But anyway, one day, she and I drove to LA. So I was a couple of hours drive, and we met with a talent agent. And he took a lot of headshots of me, and he asked me to read some stuff. And, he asked things like, do sing or dance or ride a horse, that kind of thing. And he left the room. And I remember asking my mom, I said, how do we know this guy? I mean, who set this up? Why am I here? And I remember it was just the strangest response. She says, oh, a friend. I mean, even as a child, I thought that was weird, and of course, nothing ever came of my TV, Hollywood star career life. But anyway, so like I said, their life before me, they didn't really talk much about it. It was always pretty vague. But, now I've learned that during their first 16 years of marriage, my mother, like I said, was a super wife, perfect housekeeping, perfectly decorated, spotless house. She was like the family party planner. Everybody did the holidays at her house. She even actually ironed my dad's work pants. And of course, she knew how to dress too. I see pictures. She had hats and gloves. I mean, she could really look good. And even when we moved down to San Diego County, I can still remember her cleaning every Sunday morning. But that all changed when I was, I think, about 8 or 9. Her best friend, her best girlfriend, was killed in a car accident. And after that, she completely changed. I mean, it was like this, I don't know, this mental flip. There was no cleaning. She barely did the dishes. She became a hoarder. As I got older, it was hard for me to make friends. And the friends I did make, I was just, I couldn't invite them over. I was just too embarrassed. So I felt pretty lonely. And by that time, all the relatives that used to come down, we'd really just lost contact. And so my teenage years were pretty hard. I fought a lot with her. I really had no respect for her. I just kind of thought that she was unstable and uneducated. Um, so back when I was 5, 6, 7, I'm not really sure, I had what my counselor now calls a childhood trauma. And it only lasted for like a 9-month period. But as it turned out, uh, this is something that has affected me throughout my adult life. Ha! Ooh, gotta take a breath. So anyway, this is the story here. So there was this little girl. Her name was Anne Marie Garibaldi, and I'm going to say her name on purpose because, who knows? Somebody listening to this just might know. I know her. I've tried to locate her, but, women, they change their name and there's just a ton of Anne Marie Garibaldis out there. So I haven't really had any luck. But anyway, Anne came to live with us, and she was introduced as my new sister, who was going to live with us forever. So the story that I learned then was that, or I was told, was that her dad was sick. I mean, he was like terminally sick and he was dying, and that he was, looking for a new family for her to be with. And somehow the mother, I don't know, she was out of the picture, but we were going to be her new family. So, but several years ago, I actually heard a different story from that my godmother and my mom had kind of kidnapped her from this bad living situation. So, I don't know what the truth is. I no longer believe any of the stories that I was told in my childhood after finding out all of this. Anyway, at first, it was good. Anne was about a year older than me. And I can remember my mom dressing us up in really pretty dresses with that tooling. And that tooling is just awful. It just scratches you. I remember that so clearly. And pin curls, who would spend hours, she'd pin curl her hair and dry it. So we'd have all this curly hair. And, she was my sister. We had fun. And but this is also the first time that I really remember my mom being violent. Um, my mom had taken some of my dad's sawhorses, and she had taken sheets and made a tent. And so we're out there playing, some kind of little pretend kitchen or something. And somehow she swiped her fingernail across my nose, and it created a skin flap. And of course, I'm crying, and my mom comes running out, and she was just so angry, and she was yelling at Anne, and she slapped her, and then she punished her, and I just remember feeling so bad. So anyway, her father would come and visit once a month. I mean, he had gotten better, or he wasn't dying. I mean, he never looked ill to me. But as you can imagine, after their little visits, Anne would be sad and she'd get depressed, and then she'd act out. And then there were punishments, and then it would get better, and then he would visit. It was just this cycle. So I was told that my parents wrote him a letter and said, "You have to stop coming because this isn't good for Anne." And he wrote back and said, "Just one last time. Just, I want to come and I want to say goodbye. Just one last time." So I can remember this day so clearly. It was just a beautiful day, bright and clear. And I usually waited in the yard, but I could see through the screen door, and I could see the sofa, and I could see Anne and her dad talking on the sofa, and I could see my mom in there too. And I looked around, and parked in the driveway was this big dark green or purple car. And that was and this time there was a woman in the passenger side, and that was odd. That wasn't that he had never brought a woman before. And I really remember her because she had like a beehive hairdo.
Hmm.
So I'm waiting, and the lady's waiting, and I see my mom go to the back of the house. I don't know, maybe she had to go get something, or maybe to give him some privacy. I don't know. But all of a sudden, Anne's father swooped her up, and he's running out the door with her to the car. And I can hear that engine revving and the car quickly backing out, and it's going down the driveway. And my mother comes running out, and she's screaming. And she has to go find her car keys, and she puts me in the car, and we're chasing them. Of course, by that time, they're way long down the road. And we ended up going to the police station. And they didn't have any, they didn't have any papers. There was no legal documents for her living with us. And so that was it. No goodbyes. I never saw her again. So I cried and cried, oh, I want a sister. Oh, please, I want a sister. Please give me a sister, for a really long time. And that event left this like gaping hole in my life. And it unfortunately got opened up again when I contacted my half brother and half sister. So I think my parents compensated. They tried to compensate. So I'm using air quotes here. So Santa brought me a horse for Christmas, and life went on. So it was me and my horse and the animals, and they were my friends. They were my playmates because we were so rural. There wasn't anybody else around, and I was just always so sad and so lonely, and as I got older, no matter what I did, I always felt this underlying loneliness. So around 1979, my parents moved to Northern California, and eventually I moved north to the San Francisco Bay Area. And I married, and I had a daughter, Kim, and my son, Matthew. And, but, things happened, and we divorced around 10 years. But during that time, my son, at 4 years old, was diagnosed with muscular dystrophy. Now, muscular dystrophy is a genetic disorder, that gets carried down through the parents. And as I have gone through this as an MP through the NPE process, I've thought, wasn't there ever a good time for my mom to tell me about my biological father? Wouldn't that really have been a good time, the perfect time to pull me aside and say, hey, I've got some information. I mean, we're going through this diagnostic process, and that kind of information would have been important, but she never did. And I feel angry about that. But, as it does, life went on. So in 1996, I was 41 years old and single. And I didn't want to be, but I became a cougar. And I met a young man that's 10 years my junior. And we married, and we've been married 23 years. And I have 3 girls, Emily, who is 12, and I have twins, Haley and Hannah, that are 10. Now, Craig is my husband. He is such a great guy. He took on so much, my severely disabled son. I mean, Matt, as the disease progressed, really became a quadriplegic. He took on that, and then later, my mom and dad moved in. It's been a lot, but now we're in a good place, and we're raising our girls in North Carolina. We're doing well. I have a big house, 10 acres. It's all good, but back in 2003, we're still in California, and my parents were in their 90s, and they had to move in because of my dad's health. And so living in the house was me, my husband, my disabled son, and then my mom and dad. And my mom, she did not want to move. She didn't want to she didn't want to be there. I mean, it was between our house and assisted living, and she didn't want to do that. She was just so unhappy, so angry. She had a really hard time adjusting, and she was just upset a lot. But over the years, I had felt like something or some abuse had happened to my mom. And I started noticing when we were watching news stories or like a movie where a man would hurt a woman or a woman was raped, in the news, something like that, her reaction would be like totally over the top. At least I thought so. She'd say things like, they ought to take him out and shoot him. But usually it was more violent and it was about genitals. They ought to cut off his pecker with a butcher knife. And then one particular time, she said, they should repeatedly slam his old dick in the sliding glass door. I mean, it got so bad, I had to take her aside. I said, you've got to stop this. It's making Craig and Matthew cringe. I wouldn't let them talk about mutilating women. She eventually stopped. But, it made me wonder, was she attacked and why was she so angry with men? Over the past year, I just wonder what happened to her that made her feel that way. So living all together was challenging. And she and I were like totally different personalities. She needed to be the center of attention at all time, whether good or bad. And I'm not like that at all. So personality wise, we're different. Physically, we're different. She was like 5 foot nothing, and I'm 5'10" Amazon woman. And I got so frustrated and I got so angry that I became convinced that I must be adopted. So back then there was no ancestry DNA kits. You could get them, but you had to go to the drugstore and swab your mouth and mail it in and wait for the results. So I have to say I tricked her. I told her that a doctor had requested it, and she went along with it. So we get the results back, and it turned out that she was 98% for sure my mom, and so that made me even more frustrated at how she acted. It never ever dawned on me to check if I to check my dad, to check my dad's DNA. If I had, they would have been both alive, but this whole thing would have unfolded so differently. But I really think even if I'd had, the test in hand, that they would have denied it and just said, nope, didn't happen. So a couple of years later, my dad passed away in 2005, and my mom continued to live with us. Now, Craig, my husband, he always said that when we were married 10 years, that he wanted to do a recommitment ceremony. So in lieu of that, in 2008, we chose to start a family. So at 53, I delivered my daughter, Emily. And then at almost 55, I delivered our twins, Haley and Hannah. And this was this time period, it was really a happy time for us. But, then a couple of years later, New Year's Eve, 2012, my son Matthew passed away from the muscular dystrophy. And then 6 months later, my mom passed away. So, frankly, I'd really had enough sadness in California. And Craig, he was able to take early retirement. So we ended up moving, 3,000 miles away to North Carolina. It was a good move for us, and we were doing well. And our anniversary came up in 2016. We were talking about what to get each other, and so we figured out for fun we would get a DNA test, and see where we came from. So we chose National Geographic test. I don't even know if they still have tests, but that's the one we got. And I always would tease Craig. I always teased him that he was part Neanderthal. And yes, it turned out he was 2%. And then I was Viking. So, and we had a good laugh. It was fun. So then in the spring of 2019, I got the genealogy bug. And so I started wondering about my daughters. We had used an egg donor because I was an older mother. We'd used an egg donor, and the donor was from Australia. So we thought, that would be great. And then, growing up, I knew most of my dad's family. But on my mom's side, it was a mystery, so I was thinking, because all of her siblings had been split up. after her parents had died. So it was like this long lost family. So this time I got an ancestry DNA kit, and I'm still kind of unfamiliar with the matching numbers, and how that all worked. But there was one cousin's name that I recognized on my mom's side. It tied back to my grandmother, and there was a bunch of third and fourth cousins. But it was kind of weird. There was the names of these of three men that were in my first, second cousin position. I had no clue who they were at all. But I messaged them through Ancestry, but I got no replies. So I just kind of let go. And then strangely, there was no family on my dad's side. But I just made it all fit. I told myself, well, those three guys, those men, they're long lost cousin on my mom's side, and as far as my dad's side, that's not unusual. Some people aren't interested, or maybe they didn't have the funds, and then I just kind of put the ancestry stuff away, and I didn't really check it anymore. Then 6 months later, in November 2019, I got an email through Ancestry from this gal named Adrienne. And she says, I just did my DNA and I think we're related. I was like so excited, so we texted briefly back and forth, and then we decided to talk on the phone. So, of course, apparently I'm a know-it-all and I had it all figured out. And so I looked at the numbers and we matched in the high 800s. And, she must be a cousin on my mom's side. I mean, I was sure of it had to be. So she is just the sweetest lady. And so I started out and I come out with all the details. I said, well, my mother was Bertha and she grew up in Kansas and my grandmother was Nancy and so on and so forth. And, she listened. And finally she said, I don't think that's how we're related. What? No, that's the only way it can be, right? She said, my mother has passed away, but she had a brother, Herbert. And I think he's your biological father. I'm like, no, no way. So she also informed me that I had a half brother and a half sister. And it turned out that the three male DNA matches from 6 months ago, they were my siblings' children. So, I was like shocked. I just couldn't believe it for days. I tried to make the information fit together in some other fashion, an uncle of this and blah, blah, blah. I just, no matter what I did, it had to be true that my dad was not my dad. So my biological cousin, Adrienne, she shared all that she knew about my bio dad, Herb. She sent pictures, and for the first time, it was just so fabulous to see people who actually looked like me. I mean, I never really felt like I didn't look like my family, but these people I really looked like. And particularly my bio dad was related. He looked a lot like, or my son who passed away looked a lot like him. So I learned also that in 1955, my biological dad owned a prosperous manufacturing company in Santa Monica. And, that's where my parents lived. And I also learned that this was Adrienne's favorite uncle. But even so, I thought my first thought was mom was raped. I mean, that was it. That was the first thing I thought of. She had to be, right? Adrienne had described him as very charming, handsome, a kind man, and she thought that he probably would have found my mom very attractive, but certainly not a rapist or a man that would ever force himself on my mother or any woman. But we still couldn't figure it out how they, might have known each other. And the idea that my mother being unfaithful, the way she talked to me as I was growing up about premarital sex and, the sins of being loose, it was just unthinkable. This godly woman stepping outside the marriage. I just could not, I couldn't come to terms with it. So looking back over the next few months was kind of strange. My reaction was strange. I first called everybody I knew and I said, guess what? Guess what? My dad's not my dad. I remember, I don't know, something was wrong with me, but I remember even like repairmen coming out. I get to talking to them and I'd share. Guess what? I found out my dad's not my dad. I mean, that's kind of weird. I even asked my cousins, did you know anything ever? Now lots of people said, well, your dad is your dad and he loved you. Well, I mean, I guess that was true, but it didn't make me feel any better. And then another cousin, she said, oh, yeah, my brother and I, we always wondered how you fit into the family because you sure don't look like the rest of us. Well, that just really made me feel even more disconnected. So then I searched the internet, for any stories, any help, of how to deal with this or to find, finally, I found the DNA Facebook support group, and just reading other people's stories, I came to the conclusion that meeting your biological family is kind of like the lottery. Sometimes you are a big winner, and you get that loving family and it's just wonderful and they embrace you. Or on the other side, it doesn't work out so well. They may even deny that you even exist. Now, my counselor, she says that, the biological family is also surprised. They're also shocked. And they need time to come to terms. I think she's right. I mean, at least in my case, that's how it's working out. So, when I was doing my outline, right here is where I was going to stick in my big tip for those that were beginning in the process. But, now I realize that people listening to this, they are already down the line in this process and they've already probably made contact with their family and have done and said things to people that they wish they could change uh, or take back. And before I contacted my siblings, I had not thought through things, and I have my regrets about that. So my new bio cousin, Adrian, she acted kind of as the go between. She had told me that my siblings are very private people. And so she shared some information about them, or she shared that I existed with them, and then she also told me about them. And as it turns out, we grew up and lived in very, very different worlds. Now, I didn't grow up poor, but we had to be frugal. But on the other side, I believe my siblings grew up more comfortable, perhaps less financially restrained. My brother, he lives a modest life. He's lived a modest life. And when I contacted him, the last time I had contact with him and we texted back and forth, the last time I did text him, he wished me a good life. So I kind of took that, or I take that to mean that, he's not interested in a relationship. Now, my sister, on the other hand, she's a lot more comfortable. She's very financially stable. And I believe she knows many famous people. And let's just say we just do not run in the same circles at all. So finally, we get on the phone and, it went so. But in hindsight, I should have been more together with my positive thoughts. Because I think as we talked, the call got a little bit too comfortable. And what I said wrong was I wondered out loud that if her father could possibly have forced himself on my mother. Yeah. And of course, she said, no way. I really think that I should have maybe saved that for later or not said that at all. So we texted, a few more times over the next couple of months. But in the end, she decided that she, first of all, was not going to tell her adult children about me, although I thought they were on Ancestry, so wouldn't they know? But I guess their accounts are no longer, I don't know. But she also decided she could not have a relationship with me because it disrespected her father's memory. Now I wrote and I texted, oh, I'm a big girl and, that'll be fine. And I'll be fine. And how sad that we won't have a relationship and blah, blah, blah. But in truth, I was crushed because it took me straight back to that loss of my childhood sister, Anne, and finding out that I had living siblings was like the greatest thing ever through this process, but it's one of my biggest hurts. And so that was back in February 2020. But then my investigation work took me in a whole new direction, and a direction that would lead me to finding answers. So after the siblings kind of turned down my relationship, I still wanted to know, other people and who might know how I got here, people on my mother's side. So, it was really, I was just left really sorting through old photographs and trying to think of anyone who might know anything. And one person that I connected with over the years, kind of spotty, but we connected, was my cousin Dana. Now, her mother was my dad's sister, who in 1937 initially had made the move with my mom and dad from Missouri to California. And we always knew Dana was adopted. And so she was my adopted daughter of my Aunt Alice. And we had visit them when I was young up in Los Angeles. But at some point, Aunt Alice got sick, and she and Dana moved back to Missouri, and unfortunately, she passed, and I lost contact. But then in 1990, made contact again at my uncle's funeral, and that was kind of funny because here's all my cousins. Well, they weren't really my cousins, but my cousins on my dad's side, and we ended up kind of all sitting around in my deceased uncle's house and chatting, and we had this whole kind of powwow thing going on. And I remember this feeling of, my God, this is what it feels like to have family around, and it was just euphoric. It was just wonderful. So anyway, so we lost contact again, and so we lost contact in 1998. And so I knew that about 10 years later, I knew that she lived in like the Los Angeles area. So I looked on the internet, and I found a few phone numbers, and I called. I had no luck. So this really weird, strange thing. I woke up last summer, and I woke up and I decided I needed to look for her again. So I think I felt the need. I was feeling this real strong need to make any family connection. So we had moved from California to North Carolina, and the last I knew, she lived in the Los Angeles area. So using, Facebook and Ancestry and some background sites, I found her, but not where I expected. Uh, to my surprise, she was no longer living in California, but actually, she lived 10 minutes away from me in North Carolina. 10 minutes away. So I wasn't going to try to call her or nothing. So I jumped in the car and I drove to her house. I drove up the driveway and I parked in front of her open garage. And this little older cousin Dana came out, and I said, "Are you Dana?" And she said, "Yes." I said, "Well, I'm your cousin Marilyn." I'm sure the neighbors heard all the screaming. I mean, it was just a wonderful reunion, and it is just so wonderful that we are a family. And I have her really close, and we talk all the time, and our families get together. I mean, it's really great. So she hadn't heard she had no clue that my dad wasn't my dad. But I continued my search. I used, for my mom's family, I used Ancestry and, like I said, the internet, smart background check, Truth Finder. I paid for that. And I kept following the crumbs. And I did. I was actually had some luck. I found some cousins, and I learned kind of more of the story of my mom's childhood. And it turned out that it was pretty awful. So my cousin Dana, she noticed that I was, having success in finding all these people, and she knew she'd always known that she was adopted, and she hadn't felt like she really wanted to find siblings or parents or anything, and she kind of felt that her dad had probably passed away. So, but she decided, after seeing what was happening with me, she decided to share the information that she had. And she had her biological parents' names on her birth certificate. So, I wanted to help, and I like a challenge. Well, over the next 24 hours, I had learned that her mom had passed, and I'd found a bunch of her siblings. But the most surprising and shocking was I actually located and I called her biological father. And I said, "Are you such and such? And I'm looking for this, and, would have had known this woman," and so on and so forth. And he's like, "Yes, yes." And I said, and then they would have had a baby, and, her name is Dana. And he goes, "Guilty." Oh my God. Oh my God. I found him. And I have to say that I had to pull myself together. I think I had this emotional reaction, like I'd found my dad, my bio dad, and what it would be like. I mean, I think the child in me was really hoping for that. Anyway, they've gotten together and they have a relationship. And I'm just so happy for her. So my dad had two sisters, though. And so my other aunt was the two sisters that came with them from Missouri when they moved. And my Aunt Mary had two older daughters, and I'd actually located one of them early on Ancestry, and I'd emailed her, but I hadn't got a response, and it looked like she hadn't been on Ancestry in over a year. So, some people, they don't re-up their subscription. So actually, it was just a few months ago in April, I got an email from her, and eventually I made contact with my cousin Anita. So Anita is just this wonderful woman. She's in her 70s, but she's just bright and articulate. And I just love talking to her. But anyway, she remembered it all because she was there. She was a teenager, a young teenager. Now, my mom and dad had kind of taken care of her before I was born. And she has these just wonderful, wonderful memories of them. And she remembers them as a happy couple, not necessarily like lovey-dovey, but there wasn't, it seemed like they were having a good marriage. My mom had hoped to become pregnant, but it wasn't like this obsession to become pregnant. Uh, anyway, my Adrian, cousin Anita, she just remembers my mom so fondly. Actually, the woman she remembers is a stranger to me. The woman she knew was meticulous. I mean, she had the perfect house. She ironed my dad's pants. It could entertain, could dress to the T. To me, my mother was always loud, and she always needed to be the center of attention, good or bad. It didn't matter, just so she was getting that attention. My mom was always angry or unhappy, and she was a hoarder. Something had happened to her, both my parents really, when I was born. So Anita, she confirmed that they had a good life. But Anita answered the biggest question ever. How did my biological dad and my mom know each other? So, of course, as you can imagine, I basically interrogated Anita. And I said, now there is this name that keeps coming up in my childhood memories, Gaylord. And I think that's kind of like an odd name or a unique name. And I had learned that my bio dad's company, that was the name of it. And so I asked her, I said, does Gaylord mean anything to you? And just quietly, without any hesitation, she said, oh, yes, your mother worked there. I remember it because she gave me a set of plastic dishes that I totally cherished, and it had that stamp on it. So there was the connection. My biological father was my mother's boss. So now Anita had spent many days and hours with my mother, and she had like a wonderful time. She didn't remember my mother ever being violent or the crazy woman that I knew. She remembered, though, that the women of the family unit, the aunts and such, were really gossipy. And so many times she heard them talking about, gee, they've been married for 16 years with no pregnancy. And then all of a sudden, so, there was still all these questions, for me to answer. Why was my mom so depressed after I was born? I mean, it was supposed to be this super happy time. Was it a love affair that didn't work out? Did my dad know? Was it those family busybodies that drove them to move away? Had my bio dad helped somehow? And what about those Christmas cards, from my mom's OB? I guess that, I'll never know these answers. But anyway, I contacted my half sister. I texted her. And I have to say, it's kind of bad of me, but it was kind of like a neener. I know how they met. My mother worked for him. It's not totally clear to me how my existence tarnishes my biological dad's memory, but my sister has come up with her own truth. So she still chooses to believe that in 1955, You don't talk about sex in 1955. That my mother approached her boss and said, "Hey, my husband and I have been married for a long time. We can't have a baby. Like, could you come up and like be our sperm donor?" Yeah, I don't think that's likely to me. Yeah, it doesn't make any sense. So recently, I've just like had this light bulb moment, and I decided that I will absolutely never know how I got here. So I've decided to create my own positive feel good story that I can tell myself and whoever. So here's my story. My mother worked at a small company close with her boss. He was handsome and charming. Now, her marriage wasn't on the rocks, but my dad was not demonstrative with his affection. And Herb's marriage, was maybe having a few issues. And, he was a little unhappy. And so they are working closely, and how people, when you work close, you develop relationships. He said nice things to her. It felt good. And, they are both attractive people and they were attracted to each other. And then sometime around Valentine's Day, 1955, they simply couldn't resist, and they made mad, passionate love. It was the best sex ever, and maybe their relationship continued for a while. I don't know. Unfortunately, it didn't work out, and they both decided to stay with their spouses. And my dad was a great guy because he took care of me, even though I wasn't his. And so there it is. That's it. Coming to this has helped me feel better. I even texted my half sister again, and I said, it may be really hard to believe that our parents could be anything but perfect, faithful spouses. But, somehow they got together and I was born. And I even shared my concocted story. And to my surprise, she wrote back and she wished me peace. She said, "I hope this gives you peace." And then she said, "Perhaps we will meet in person someday." And as this process, it's ever evolving, and I've learned so much this year. But just yesterday, she texted me and she agreed to actually meet in person in the next few months. So you never know, you just don't know. So my story has not ended. And someday I might actually get to meet and know my sister and brother. Now looking back, I ask, what have I gotten out of this? Well, I found new family members on my mother's side. I reconnected with lost family. I have knowledge about my true history. I have these family photos that I can relate to. And I've gotten really, really close to my cousin Dana and my new biological cousin Adrian. In fact, she came to visit. Now like I said, I live in North Carolina and she lives in New York. And so she came and visited for a couple of days and we met in person. And it was wonderful. We just had such a fabulous time. But when she left, it dawned on me that the last time I had been around a blood relative other than my mother was 50 years ago. And it's just crazy for me to think about. So my advice to others that are going through this process is have patience. New information can be discovered. Give your new relations time, and it's not you. Love yourself and make the family and the people around you your family.
Oh, Marilyn, I really enjoyed your story, your experiences, and I love the wisdom, the bit of wisdom you added to it as well. I know a lot of people will get so much out of listening to your story today. I certainly did. And Miss Marilyn, if people want to reach out to you and know more about you, could they do that?
Yes, that would be great. Okay, so the email is strunkhouse@gmail.com. And that is S is in Sam, TRUNKHOUSE @gmail.com.
Wonderful.
I cannot tell you how much I have enjoyed this. Just getting this off my chest, I think, is healing. So thank you so much.
Oh, you're so welcome. I love to provide a space, and I like to hear the whole story, and sometimes when we write it out and share it in our support groups, you can't get all the details. So I like to hear everything. So thank you so much. These stories are here for us to identify with. If you are an NPE and would like to share your story, email npestories@gmail.com. You do not have to give any identifying information. If you are an NPE and would like to share your story, I'd like to hear from you. Subscribe to this podcast to hear more. Come heal with us.